I was not supposed to speak, that was the whole job. The Interstellar Compact sends an arbitration officer to sit in the gallery of a forfeiture hearing, watch the clock, watch the seals, and confirm afterward that the law did what the law was written to do. Nobody expects the auditor to open his mouth. In 11 years on the tribunal corps, I never had. The hall was called the vaulted chamber, though there was nothing grand about it up close. A wide stone floor on relay station Corin, skylights letting in the flat gray daylight of a system with a dim little sun, and a countdown board mounted above the dais that had been running for 6 days. When I walked in that morning, it read 4 hours, 11 minutes. By local custom, everything of consequence on Corin closes or opens at midnight, and the Ilsatha Treaty, 3 centuries old, written after a war nobody alive remembered, closes hardest of all. The treaty's forfeiture clause was simple, in the way that cruel things are simple. If a sovereign of the Ilsatha line went unclaimed by a contender of sufficient rank when the station clock struck midnight, her person and her remaining holdings transferred, in full, to whichever registered claimant had filed first. It was old law, older than mercy, and it had not been triggered in 90 years. It was being triggered today because Queen Kesari Vondre Ilsatha, 40 years old, no living heir, a decade of drought and border losses behind her, had been declared, by her own council, no longer sovereign enough to matter. I'd read the file. Officially, the council called her tenure administratively concluded. Unofficially, 3 of her ministers had told me over the tribunal's translated feed that she was barren, that she was too old to remarry into strength, that keeping her on the throne would only remind their neighbors how weak the line had become. One of them used the word worthless. He didn't know I understood the dialect without the translator running. I didn't correct him. She sat alone on a low bench near the dais, in a plain gray morning coat instead of anything ceremonial, because no one had thought to dress her for a day meant to strip her of a title. Her skin was a deep copper brown that caught what daylight came through the glass. Her hair was black, with one deliberate streak of white combed through it, the Ilsatha mark of a monarch who has buried more than she has crowned. Her eyes were storm gray, and she kept them on the countdown board instead of on the room, the way you watch a wound you can't do anything about. At 2 hours, her last attendant bowed and left, not dismissed, just gone, quietly, the way people leave a house before the bank arrives. She didn't call after him. She didn't move at all. At 1 hour, the Dominion of Vral filed their claim. I watched the clerk stamp it, first in the queue, exactly as they'd planned it for months, judging by the paperwork. Vral's claimant was a trade magistrate named Solveth Orr, a man who had never set foot on Corin before that week, and would own the last of her ancestral holdings, and her, by midnight, unless someone with equal or higher standing filed first, and she chose to accept it. That chose to accept it clause was the only mercy left in the whole treaty. 90 years unused. Nobody in that room expected it to matter today. At 30 minutes, she finally looked at me, not at the dais, not at the board, at me, in the gallery, where I had no business being looked at. "You're the human auditor," she said, flat, not unkind, just tired past the point of caring how it sounded. "Callan Reyes," I said, "Tribunal Corps." "Then you know what happens at midnight." "I know what the paperwork says happens." Something moved behind her eyes. Not hope, I want to be clear about that, because hope would have been foolish, and she had stopped being foolish decades ago. It was closer to recognition that I'd said something true instead of something comforting. "The paperwork," she said, "has already decided I am a line item. Paperwork's wrong before. Not this paperwork, not on this station. Ask Magistrate Orr. He's been drafting the transfer language since spring." I didn't answer that. I went back to my seat, and I did the thing I actually did well, which was read. I read the treaty's registration clause 4 more times in the time I had left, the way you read a door you're not sure is locked. Registered claimant of sufficient rank. Rank, on Corin, under compact oversight law, not Ilsatha law, compact law, the treaty they'd bolted onto the old one when the Corps took over arbitration 80 years back. Rank meant any accredited officer of a signatory government, filing in good standing, with no conflict of interest on record. I had no conflict of interest. I had, as of that morning, no wife, no dependents, no claim of my own anywhere in the galaxy that would complicate the filing. I had, In other words, exactly the standing required, and about 11 minutes to decide whether standing was the same thing as right. I want to say I thought it through, like a man reasoning his way to a conclusion. I didn't. I thought about a woman sitting alone in a morning coat, while her own government filed the paperwork to hand her to a stranger, and about every minister who'd used the word worthless in a hallway where they thought no human could understand them, and I stood up and walked to the clerk's station with 6 minutes on the board. "I'd like to file," I said. The clerk, an older Ilsatha man with tired eyes, looked at me the way you look at someone who has wandered into the wrong building. "Filing requires accredited rank and no conflict of interest, Officer Reyes." "I know. Run it." He ran it. 5 minutes, 40 seconds. The board updated. A second claimant. Filed and accepted. Standing confirmed. A murmur went through the handful of ministers still in the room. Not outrage exactly, more the particular startled silence of men watching a rule they'd never bothered to learn suddenly matter. Magistrate Orr stood up from his bench, already half laughing, already reaching for an objection that wasn't going to exist. "This is absurd. He has no relationship to the crown, no history with this house." "He has standing," the clerk said, not looking up from the ledger. "The treaty does not require history. It requires standing and her consent." Her consent. That was the part nobody in that room had thought would ever be tested again. 90 years of nobody filing a second claim meant 90 years of nobody making the Queen choose anything at all. 4 minutes on the board. Kasari hadn't moved from the bench, but she was looking at me now with an expression I still don't have the right word for. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more like disbelief that had run out of places to hide. "You understand what you've filed," she said quietly. "You'll own nothing. There's nothing left to own. Drought debt, a dying line, a title with no court behind it. You'd be taking on a woman my own counsel called a line item, for a holding that's worth less than the fee you just paid to file." "I didn't file for the holding." "Then why?" "Because at 2 hours, somebody walked out of this room and left you here like you'd already stopped being a person to argue for," I said. "And I decided I could sit in that gallery another 5 minutes. Or I could stand somewhere. It'd cost me something." The board read 2 minutes, or was still objecting, quieter now, to a clerk who had stopped listening to him. Kasari stood, slowly, the way someone stands when they've been sitting with the weight of an ending for 6 days and haven't yet let themselves believe it might not come. She crossed the floor. Up close, her eyes weren't just gray, they were the color a sky goes right before weather changes, and they were wet without spilling over, steady, composed, carrying more than her voice was letting through. "I have not been asked to choose anything in longer than I can tell you," she said. "Ask me properly, Officer Reyes. The treaty requires it said aloud." "Kasari Vondre Ilsatha," I said. "Will you accept the claim?" 1 minute. The board's numbers ticked down behind her, and for once in that whole cold room, nobody was watching it. She reached out and set her hand over mine, not a grand gesture, just a hand, warm, certain, and said, "I will." The clock struck midnight while our hands were still together. The board didn't flare or chime. It simply stopped. The transfer clause closed and settled. 3 centuries of cruelty spending itself on the smallest possible act. One woman deciding she was still allowed to choose, and one man deciding that showing up counted for something after all. Magistrate Orr filed his complaint the next morning. It went nowhere. The clerk told me later it was the first consent clause invoked on Corin in 91 years, and that he'd had to look up the wording twice to be sure he was reading it right. I didn't marry a queen for a throne. There wasn't one left worth taking. I filed for a woman sitting alone in a gray coat while everyone she'd ever governed decided she'd stopped mattering. 5 minutes before a clock made it official. Some contracts close on the stroke of midnight. Ours opened there instead.